It started as an ordinary evening in Fort Worth, Texas, March 2025. Rana Nofal Soluri, a 47-year-old flight attendant, disappeared without warning. One day she was there, the next she was gone. No calls, no messages, no trace. Her brand new car was left behind. Her phone vanished. Her husband and friends reported her missing, but the search brought nothing. Weeks passed, then months. Police combed through neighborhoods, rivers, and wooded areas. Flyers went up across the city, but there was no sign of Rana. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. And then, an accident changed everything. A random butt dial, an accidental phone call, captured voices, noises of something heavy being moved, and chilling words. "Help me. Make sure the lid's on." That recording cracked the case wide open. In June 2025, authorities arrested Dennis William Day, a man who lived with Rana. He confessed to strangling her after a confrontation. He claimed he stuffed her body in a trash bin and dumped it off a bridge near Bowie, Texas. But when police searched the area, there was nothing. Flooding may have washed the remains away. 2 months later, a second arrest. 62-year-old Joni Thomas was charged with helping cover up the crime. Surveillance footage showed Day dragging what looked like a body into his backyard the night Rana disappeared. Her Mazda sat untouched in his driveway for weeks. He admitted to tossing her phone into a river and her gun into a drain. Police later recovered the gun. And yet, Rana herself has never been found. This is not just the story of a missing person. It's the story of a shocking confession, a hidden recording, and a family left without answers. Even with suspects behind bars, the most important piece of evidence, the body of Rana Nofal Soluri, remains missing. Rana Nofal Soluri was 47 years old when she vanished in March 2025. She lived in Fort Worth, Texas, in a quiet residential neighborhood not far from Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. Her life appeared stable. Her career was steady. She was not the kind of person anyone expected to simply disappear. Rana worked as a flight attendant. It was a job she had done for years, one she took pride in. Colleagues described her as reliable, friendly, and always professional. She was the kind of crew member passengers remembered for her warmth and the way she made long flights feel easier. Coworkers said she loved traveling but loved coming home even more. She balanced the demands of constant flights with a routine that kept her grounded in Fort Worth. Her friends painted a picture of someone approachable and upbeat. Rana was described as social but not reckless. She had a wide circle of acquaintances, people she had met through work and through her community. She was the kind of person who returned texts, who showed up for gatherings, who remembered birthdays. For many who knew her, she was dependable. She did not simply cut off contact or vanish without warning. At home, Rana lived with her husband. Their relationship was described by neighbors as typical of a couple in their 40s. She also had close ties to extended family and co-workers. People in her life emphasized that she had roots. She had obligations, friendships, and connections that anchored her in Fort Worth. Her background was clean. Rana had no criminal history. She had no pattern of instability. She was not known to use drugs, she had no record of disappearing for days, and she did not express any desire to abandon her life. Police would later confirm that there was no evidence of her preparing for a move, withdrawing unusual amounts of money, or setting up a hidden plan. She simply went missing without context. And that was what made her case so troubling. Her career as a flight attendant often took her across the country. But even when she was away, she kept up communication. Friends said she regularly called to check in. Family recalled that she almost always shared her travel schedule. If there was a delay, she let people know. She was a creature of habit. Her routines were predictable. Co-workers remembered her as easy to travel with, someone who could get along with different personalities in a confined space. She loved talking about the places she had visited, the restaurants she had tried, the people she had met. Yet, despite her exposure to the world, she stayed grounded. She liked coming back to her car, her home, her neighborhood. That balance between travel and stability was a defining part of her life.
Friends noted that Rana enjoyed simple pleasures. She loved to smile. She loved traveling for leisure as much as she did for work. She liked shopping, catching up with friends over coffee, and planning her next trip. She was described as calm, easygoing, not the type to get caught up in conflict. People agreed she was not confrontational. This quiet, steady personality only deepened the shock when her disappearance was reported. Her lifestyle showed stability. Rana owned a Mazda 2023, a brand new car she was proud of. She drove it regularly to work, to shops, to meet with friends. That car would later become one of the first red flags in her disappearance. Financially, she was secure. She did not live beyond her means. She had no significant debts. There was no sign of sudden financial stress or a reason to walk away. Investigators found her accounts normal and her spending patterns consistent with her life before March 2025. Her daily routines revealed no sign of distress. She kept her appointments. She stayed in touch with friends. She had no medical issues that suggested confusion or disappearance. There were no records of her buying tickets out of state. No activity on her credit cards after she vanished. The key contrast in Rana's story is that everything about her life suggested permanence. Outwardly, she was a successful, stable professional in her late 40s, well-liked, with no clear enemies or dangers surrounding her. Internally, nothing pointed to a woman planning to vanish. Police later emphasized that there was no diary entry, no message, no behavior that hinted at a voluntary disappearance. Rana's life had no cracks that explained her sudden absence. Her case struck a nerve because it defied expectations. She was not a troubled teenager. She was not someone running from debt. She was not a person with a history of instability. She was a respected flight attendant, a wife, a friend. To those around her, she was ordinary in the best way, steady, grounded, connected. And that very ordinariness was what made her disappearance stand out. When the missing person report was filed, the first questions investigators asked were predictable. Did she have a history of leaving home? Did she struggle with substance abuse? Was she under financial pressure? Did she talk about disappearing? In Rana's case, the answer to all of these was no. Nothing fit. Neighbors told police that she was active in her community and never showed signs of wanting to run away. Friends stressed that she was excited about upcoming plans and trips. Family members said she was in regular contact and had made no sudden moves. To police, her car became a critical piece of the early investigation. That new Mazda sat parked at Dennis Day's residence long after Rana was gone. It was not abandoned in a distant state. It was not stolen or missing. It stayed visible,
a strange reminder of her presence, yet without her. Investigators noted this as one of the first hard signs that her disappearance was not voluntary. The combination of her clean history, her strong network, and her stable lifestyle made it impossible for investigators to explain her absence through ordinary means. Her case did not look like a runaway. It did not look like someone leaving a troubled marriage in secret. It looked like something had gone very wrong. This contrast between her predictable, stable life and the sudden silence after March 2025 was at the core of the investigation. It shocked the Fort Worth community. People who knew her struggled to understand. They told reporters that Rana would not leave without telling someone. They insisted she loved her job, her family, and her life. And yet she was gone. By the time police reviewed her habits, her contacts, her finances, and her routines, one conclusion became clear. Rana Nofal Soluri did not walk away. Something happened to her. And that realization turned a missing persons report into a criminal investigation that would later expose secrets, confessions, and arrests. Her introduction, her background, and her daily life show why this case stood out. Rana was ordinary, steady, reliable. She had no reason to vanish. Which is exactly why when she did, her case shook not only her family and friends, but the entire Fort Worth community. On the night of March 21st, 2025, the ordinary routine of a Fort Worth household turned into the beginning of one of the city's most disturbing mysteries. Rana Nofal Soluri, 47 years old, a longtime flight attendant, was last seen alive inside the home she shared with her husband and her housemate, 66-year-old Dennis William Day. She had returned from work only days earlier, settling into her usual life. There was nothing to suggest danger was close. No warning signs, no obvious conflicts. But that night, something happened behind closed doors. The last confirmed evidence of Rana comes from a surveillance camera. Installed at the home of Dennis Day, it captured a grainy, chilling image. A man dragging what appeared to be a heavy, human-shaped object into the backyard. Investigators would later identify that man as Dennis Day himself. The timestamp read March 21st. It was the night Rana disappeared. The immediate signs raised more questions than answers. Her 2023 Mazda, barely a year old, remained parked in the driveway, keys still in the house. Rana was known to drive everywhere, especially for errands and work trips. For her car to be left behind was out of character. Inside the home, there were no broken windows, no signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture. The kind of violence that leaves chaos in its wake was absent. On the surface, it looked almost too normal. But it was this very normalcy that felt wrong. Her phone was missing. A few personal belongings were unaccounted for. Yet everything else, her clothes, her travel documents, her identification, was untouched. For someone with an international career, walking away without essentials like a passport or credit cards seemed impossible. Her family noticed the silence immediately. Rana had built her life around travel, long hours, and time away from home. But no matter where she was, she always called. Even on short layovers, she checked in with relatives. Days without contact were unheard of. When the calls stopped and the text messages never came, the alarm bells started ringing. At first, friends thought maybe she had gone away unexpectedly, maybe a short trip, maybe some private time. But that theory didn't hold. Days turned into nearly a week. By then, the worry was unbearable. Rana's family reported her missing to Fort Worth police. Police began with the basics. Officers visited the home, walked through the rooms, and examined the backyard. They spoke with her husband, and they spoke with Dennis Day. Both men gave statements. Day claimed Rana had left abruptly. No details, no reason, just gone. But investigators quickly noticed inconsistencies. If she had really walked out, where had she gone? Why leave her car in the driveway? Why abandon her bank accounts, her new vehicle, and her passport? And why was her phone nowhere to be found? Despite these questions, in the early days, there wasn't enough evidence to treat the disappearance as a homicide. The case was marked as a missing person file. Authorities kept records, but without a body, without a scene, and without clear evidence of foul play, they could not move further. What remained in plain sight only deepened suspicion. Her Zada, the car she had proudly purchased new in 2023, became a silent witness. It sat, unused, collecting dust, a visible reminder that Rana had not chosen to leave on her own. More troubling still, her financial life stopped cold. No new charges appeared on her credit cards, no withdrawals from her bank. For a woman with steady income, steady bills, and steady routines, that kind of sudden freeze was unnatural. Family members pressed investigators to dig deeper. They described Rana as reliable, predictable in her habits, not the kind of woman to vanish without explanation. They argued that she had not only disappeared, but had been silenced. In the following days, news of her disappearance broke across Fort Worth. Local television stations aired her photograph, her description, and the details of her last known appearance. She was portrayed as a professional, respected in her work and deeply connected to her community. Headlines called her the flight attendant vanished. Friends and colleagues organized search efforts. Flyers went up in neighborhoods. Volunteers combed through wooded areas, empty lots, and rural highways outside the city. Helicopters circled nearby tracts of land. Strangers joined family members in searching fields and riverbanks. Despite the scope of the effort, nothing surfaced. As the first week turned into the second, the absence of answers left a vacuum. Rumors began circulating. Some speculated she had run away. Others whispered about possible conflicts inside the household. But none of these theories had evidence to support them. Behind the scenes, detectives were quietly frustrated. They had surveillance video of Dennis Day dragging a suspicious object, but without more context, they could not confirm it was connected to Rana. They had a missing woman, a parked car, a missing phone, and inconsistent statements from the people closest to her, but no body, no crime scene. No physical evidence strong enough to push charges forward. The lack of progress weighed heavily on the community. Fort Worth residents were uneasy. A woman had vanished in their own city, and no one could say why or how. The family faced their own torment. They pleaded for updates. They called police almost daily. They spoke to reporters trying to keep Rana's name in the headlines, refusing to let the case drift into obscurity. Their determination kept pressure on investigators, but it could not produce the one thing everyone needed: proof. Forensic teams revisited the house. They checked floors, drains, even outdoor trash bins. But in those first weeks, nothing conclusive turned up. It was as if Rana had been erased from her own life. The case stalled. Media outlets that had covered the story heavily began to scale back. Volunteers lost energy. Leads dried up. Without fresh evidence, the file sat. By the end of spring 2025, Rana's disappearance had reached its first dead end. She was gone. Her car sat untouched. Her phone remained missing. Her accounts stayed silent. And the only person who seemed to know more, Dennis Day, continued to insist that she had simply left. But investigators knew better. They knew people don't walk away from new cars, bank accounts, and passports. They knew families don't suddenly stop hearing from a loved one who called them every week. And they knew that surveillance video doesn't lie.
Still, without a body, without hard forensic proof, the law could go no further. Rana's case, for the moment, remained in limbo. A missing person file, a name on a flyer, a photograph on the evening news. What no one knew then was that the silence would last for months. No trace, no evidence, no answers. Until an accidental phone call, a so-called butt dial, would crack the case wide open and finally expose the truth of what happened to Rana Nofal Soluri. Within days, her family organized vigils and public appeals. They pleaded for information, for anyone who had seen Rana to come forward. Churches opened their doors for prayer services. Friends created online groups to spread awareness. Flyers with her photograph, smiling in her flight attendant uniform, were plastered across Fort Worth. But the weeks dragged on, and nothing surfaced. Police received tips, but most were dead ends. Someone claimed to have seen a woman matching her description near a bus stop. Another thought she had been spotted at a gas station convenience store. Detectives followed up, checked surveillance footage, but none of it was Rana. The family's frustration grew. Rana's husband called the police almost daily for updates. Her brother-in-law gave interviews demanding a stronger response. Her colleagues in the airline industry held fundraisers to support search teams. Yet despite all of this, no concrete lead emerged. By late April, exhaustion set in. Rana's relatives described sleepless nights, waiting by the phone for news that never came. Her closest friends admitted they had started to lose hope. Some community members began whispering about the possibility that Rana had chosen to leave. But her family rejected that outright. Search efforts expanded. Volunteers combed through wooded areas, trails, and parks around Fort Worth. They walked along the banks of the Trinity River. Drones were used in some searches. Nothing was found. Her disappearance became a story that haunted the entire city. Everyone knew her face. Grocery stores kept flyers by the register. Local news stations ran updates almost every evening. "Flight attendant vanished" became the headline repeated across networks. Community meetings were organized to discuss safety. People asked why Rana's case seemed stalled. Police reassured the public that they were working every angle. But without evidence of a crime, the search lacked direction. It was like trying to find a shadow in the dark. By May, the case was firmly in the public eye. Local television networks conducted interviews with neighbors, co-workers, and anyone who knew Rana. They highlighted her reputation as a dedicated flight attendant, her stable life, her wide circle of friends. Reporters questioned why no progress had been made. Why was Rana's car, a Mazda 2023, still parked at her home if she had supposedly left on her own? Why had her credit cards and passport not been used? Why were there no phone records after the night she vanished? The inconsistencies added fuel to the fire. The pressure on law enforcement increased, but investigators remained stuck. They needed evidence to move forward, and there was none. Detectives dug into Rana's financial records. No bank activity, no withdrawals, no credit card charges. Her accounts were frozen in time after March 21st. They traced her phone records. No outgoing calls, no data use, no pings off nearby towers. It was as if the device had been deliberately destroyed or discarded. They checked airports across Texas.
Rana, a flight attendant, would have stood out if she tried to travel. But her name never appeared on any passenger manifest. There was no record of her boarding any flight. Even her Mazda remained parked in the driveway of the house she shared with her husband and Dennis William Day. That fact alone told investigators that Rana hadn't simply packed up and gone. If she wanted to leave, why abandon her brand-new car? Why leave her personal documents, her IDs, her credit cards? The evidence suggested one thing. Rana had not left of her own free will. But proving that, without a body, without a crime scene, was nearly impossible. From the start, Dennis Day insisted that Rana had left suddenly. He told police that she walked out and never returned. But her family knew this was not consistent with her habits. Rana didn't vanish without warning. She didn't cut off communication. This clash between Day's statements and the family's insistence deepened suspicion. Still, suspicion alone wasn't enough. Investigators couldn't arrest someone based on gut feelings or inconsistencies. They needed proof, and proof was missing. By May and June, the weight of uncertainty began breaking the family apart. Relatives described the grief as worse than death because there was no closure. Rana's husband appeared withdrawn in public, avoiding interviews after initial appeals. Her extended family, on the other hand, continued to speak out, pressing law enforcement to do more. At local churches, candles were lit every week. Community vigils became routine. Hundreds attended, holding posters with her picture, chanting her name, "Bring Rana home." Her case was no longer just a police matter. It had become a communal wound, a symbol of fear that someone could vanish from Fort Worth without a trace. By July, 4 months after Rana's disappearance, the trail was ice cold. Detectives had no new leads, no credible sightings, no forensic breakthroughs. Her family's appeals grew more desperate. They began to fear that Rana would be lost forever in the sea of unresolved missing person cases in the United States. In private, some investigators admitted they had little hope. Without new evidence, through spring and summer, silence was the only constant. No phone call from Rana, no email, no appearance on cameras anywhere in the city. For the family, silence became the cruelest answer. Every day without news deepened the certainty that Rana had not chosen to disappear. Something had been done to her. Neighbors and co-workers echoed that belief. They told reporters that Rana was reliable, predictable. She had no reason to walk away. Her sudden absence was an anomaly that pointed to only one conclusion. Something terrible had happened. By late summer, Fort Worth lived with her absence like a shadow over the city. People remembered the posters. They remembered the vigils. But gradually, as weeks stretched into months, the coverage slowed. News stations moved on to other stories. Still, Rana's family refused to let the case fade. They organized one last large-scale search in August. Volunteers scoured wooded areas and riverbanks. Dogs were brought in to track scents. Nothing. At that point, hope began to collapse. To many, Rana's fate seemed sealed. But no one knew when, how, or by whom. By September, 6 months after she vanished, the investigation was effectively stalled. No new leads, no new evidence,
No suspects officially named. The silence was suffocating. People began comparing Rana's case to other cold cases in Texas. Women who disappeared, never to be found. Their families left with endless questions. The fear was real. Rana might become just another name on a list. Her story unfinished. And then, everything changed. It started with a phone call. Not a normal call, but a mistake. What people often call a butt dial. A phone activated by accident, recording voices that weren't meant to be heard. That single mistake carried the sound of something sinister. Heavy object.
It was the summer of 2025 when everything changed. For months, the disappearance of 47-year-old flight attendant Rana Nofal Soluri had gone nowhere. The case was slipping into the same darkness that swallows thousands of missing persons files across the country. No body, no evidence, no progress. Friends and family feared Rana's story would be forgotten. Then came a phone call that no one had expected. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't planned. It was what investigators would later call a butt dial. A pocket dial that captured sounds no one was ever meant to hear. On that recording, officers heard noises that immediately set off alarms. The sound of something heavy being dragged, muffled voices, strained breathing. Then words, chilling words. "Help me," followed by, "Make sure the lid's on." The recording was brief, distorted, almost accidental in every way, but what it revealed changed the entire trajectory of the case. Investigators in Fort Worth moved quickly. The audio was shared with the Tarrant County District Attorney's Office. Specialists enhanced the sound, filtering out background static. What they uncovered suggested the recording was authentic, recent, and captured voices that matched individuals already connected to Rana. Her housemate, 66-year-old Dennis William Day, and his longtime friend, 62-year-old Joni Thomas. For months, both had insisted they knew nothing about Rana's disappearance. Day told police Rana had suddenly left the house one evening in March and never returned. Thomas said she had no idea where Rana went. Their stories seemed to close off every lead, but the recording pulled the floor out from under their claims. Detectives began revisiting the timeline. They checked the surveillance camera mounted on Day's property. On the night of March 21st, the very night Rana was last seen, the camera showed Dennis Day dragging what appeared to be a large, heavy object across the yard. The image was grainy, and the object was wrapped, but investigators saw enough to believe it could have been a human body. That footage, paired with the strange recording, raised the stakes instantly. What had once been handled as a routine missing persons case was now being treated as a likely homicide. The evidence trail didn't stop there. Officers searched Day's property again. In the garage, they found traces suggesting that Rana's belongings had been tampered with. Outside, near the drainage system, a firearm registered to Rana was recovered. Day later admitted he had thrown her gun into the sewer to hide it. He also confessed to tossing her phone into the nearby Trinity River. And yet, despite these discoveries, the most important piece remained missing: Rana's body. Investigators pushed forward. They tracked the movements of Dennis Day and Joni Thomas in the weeks after Rana's disappearance. Cell phone data showed Thomas's phone pinging near the same areas Day claimed he had dumped items. The butt dial audio, cross-referenced with their locations, gave prosecutors new confidence. This wasn't coincidence. This was coordination. The family had long believed Rana had not left voluntarily. Her car, a brand-new Mazda 2023, had sat untouched in the driveway for months. Her financial accounts showed no withdrawals. Her passport remained at home. Everything about the case screamed that she hadn't walked away. Now, with this new evidence, those reporters pressed the police for answers. The department acknowledged the recording but refused to release it publicly, citing the sensitivity of the investigation. Still, the details leaked through court filings. Words like "help me" and "make sure the lid's on" splashed across newspapers and television reports. The public couldn't ignore the grim implications. For investigators, the challenge was clear. They had audio that strongly suggested concealment of a body. They had surveillance that placed Day in suspicious activity the very night Rana vanished. They had physical evidence tying him to her belongings, and yet the absence of Rana's body threatened to complicate the case. Defense attorneys could still argue that without remains, prosecutors couldn't prove homicide. That risk didn't stop the investigation. In fact, it only fueled it. Detectives retraced Day's steps. He eventually admitted under questioning that after a violent struggle he had strangled Rana. His story was that she threatened to call the police during an argument, and in a panic he lashed out. He told investigators he stuffed her body into a trash bin and dumped it off a bridge near Bowie, Texas. Search teams descended on the area he described. They scoured rivers, creeks, and wooded paths. But spring floods had hit North Texas, and by then the current could have swept away any trace. Despite repeated searches, no remains were recovered. Meanwhile, suspicion tightened around Joni Thomas. That recording, the so-called butt dial, captured not only Day's voice but also a woman's. Investigators alleged it was Thomas, heard helping move something heavy. At one point, a voice on the tape urged caution about the lid. Prosecutors believed this meant the lid of a container holding Rana's body. Confronted with these allegations, Thomas denied involvement. She claimed she didn't know about Rana's fate and had never helped conceal evidence. But her denials were weakened by inconsistencies in her story, her proximity to Day, and the damning audio. The case had now fully shifted. In the spring of 2025, Fort Worth police had described Rana as a missing person. By late summer, the classification had changed. This was now a homicide case, with suspects, evidence, and confessions. For the family, the breakthrough was bittersweet. They had fought for months to keep Rana's name alive in the press. They had pleaded with the public to help search. Now they finally had proof that she had not chosen to leave. She had been taken from them violently. But with no body, they still had no closure, no place to lay her to rest. The investigation's turning point brought national attention. True crime outlets across the country picked up the story. Commentators pointed out how unusual it was for such a critical break to come from something as random as a pocket dial. Others emphasized the dangers of dismissing missing persons cases too early. If not for the audio, this file might have gathered dust indefinitely. Dennis Day's status shifted from suspicious housemate to the primary suspect in a homicide. Joni Thomas, once a peripheral figure, now stood accused of helping cover up the crime. Together, they faced the possibility of long prison terms. For Fort Worth residents, the revelations were stunning. They had lived with months of silence, wondering what happened to the friendly flight attendant who vanished from their neighborhood. The answer was darker than anyone had imagined. The woman who spent her career traveling the skies was now believed to have been silenced inside her own home, hidden and discarded by people she knew. And yet, the body was still missing. That fact hovered over every press conference, every headline, every whispered conversation in the community. Without a body, questions remained. Could prosecutors secure a conviction? Would a jury believe the story without the most important piece of evidence? And most painfully, where was Rana? The breakthrough marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The investigation could no longer be ignored or dismissed. It had moved from speculation to confrontation, from mystery to accusation. What started as a pocket dial became the catalyst for justice. It opened the door for indictments, for trials, for the truth to come into daylight. But it also highlighted the brutal reality. Even with suspects in custody, even with confessions on record, Rana Nofal Soluri had not been found. Her family remained trapped between hope and despair, caught in the cruel space where answers exist, but closure does not. The breakthrough of 2025 was not the end of the story. It was the point where silence broke, secrets spilled, and the path toward justice finally began. June 2025 marked a turning point in the case of Rana Nofal Soluri. For months, her disappearance had hovered in silence. Families begged for answers, volunteers searched, police followed every weak lead. But without a body, without solid evidence, it seemed like just another missing persons case fading into cold storage. Then, suddenly, everything changed. Police in Fort Worth announced the arrest of Dennis William Day, the 66-year-old housemate of Rana, the man who had lived under the same roof, the man who insisted she had left suddenly and never returned, was now in handcuffs. According to investigators, Day cracked during questioning. He admitted that on the night of March 21, 2025, an argument with Rana spiraled into violence. He told police that she threatened to call law enforcement on him. He panicked. In his version, the struggle escalated. He placed his hands on her neck. He squeezed until she stopped breathing. It was a confession that sent shockwaves across Texas. For weeks, Day had claimed Rana left voluntarily. Now, he was admitting to ending her life. But his statement went further. He described what he did next in calm detail. He placed Rana's body in a trash container, rolled it outside, and later drove to Bowie, Texas. There, he said, he pushed the container from a bridge, hoping the river and its currents would erase what he had done. Investigators cross-checked his story with the evidence already in hand. Security cameras from his home had captured him dragging a heavy object across the yard the same night Rana vanished. A butt dial, later uncovered, recorded the sound of something large being moved, with muffled voices instructing one another to make sure the lid's on. It all lined up, but there was still one glaring problem. Rana's body was nowhere to be found. Search teams combed the area near Bowie for days. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Drones scanned the river. But floods in the region complicated everything. If the container had indeed been dropped in those waters, the body might have been swept away, carried downstream, or buried in silt. For Rana's family, it was devastating. They had clung to the hope that she was alive, hiding, or being held against her will. Now, the possibility that she had been murdered was no longer speculation. It was confirmed by the very man who had lived beside her. Yet without a body, they were denied closure. Just as the case seemed to settle with one arrest, another surprise came in August 2025. Police arrested a second suspect, Joni Thomas, 62 years old. Unlike Day, she did not live with Rana, but she was closely connected. Prosecutors alleged she played a direct role in covering up what happened. The evidence against Thomas was chilling. That same accidental butt dial, the call that changed the course of the investigation, had not just captured Day's voice. It captured a woman's. Investigators identified her as Thomas. In the background, she could be heard helping move the heavy object. "Help me," one voice said. "Make sure the lid's on," another ordered. Forensic audio specialists confirmed the authenticity of the recording. Neighbors came forward saying Thomas had been seen at Day's home around the time Rana disappeared. Her denials did not match the growing pile of evidence. Thomas was charged with tampering with evidence and obstructing justice. Though she was later released on bond, the arrest shattered her reputation in the Fort Worth community. A once quiet woman was now painted in headlines as an accomplice to a brutal crime.
The back-to-back arrests jolted the city.
Local stations ran breaking news banners. Flight attendant case breaks open. Housemate confesses to killing. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse. Social media lit up with anger and disbelief. How could a 47-year-old flight attendant, who by all accounts had no enemies, end up dead at the hands of people in her own circle? The reaction was not just shock. It was fear. People in Fort Worth began asking hard questions. How well do we really know the people we live with? How many other disappearances start inside homes, hidden by people trusted to protect, not harm? For Rana's family, the arrests confirmed what they had long suspected. She hadn't run away. She hadn't chosen to leave her job, her home, or her loved ones. Someone had silenced her. Her relatives spoke to the media in measured tones, balancing grief with determination. They pleaded for authorities not to stop searching for her remains. "We need to bring her home," one family member said. "We cannot lay her to rest if we don't even know where she is." The arrests also revealed how complicated the path to justice would be. Prosecutors in Tarrant County faced a daunting task: trying a homicide case without a body. Day's confession was powerful, but defense attorneys would argue it was coerced, exaggerated, or incomplete. Without physical remains, proving murder beyond a reasonable doubt could be difficult. Still, the evidence was damning. The camera footage, the retrieved handgun discarded in a storm drain, the recovered fragments of Rana's phone fished from a riverbed, the butt dial, that became the case's most haunting piece of audio. Each detail tightened the noose around the suspects. Investigators now turned to build a timeline that would hold in court. They reconstructed Rana's last day. They gathered witness statements. They re-examined Dennis Day's financial and personal history, uncovering patterns of control and instability. They studied Joni Thomas's communications, linking her to suspicious activity in the days after Rana vanished. Every piece mattered. Every inconsistency mattered. And slowly, the picture of a crime once hidden in shadows became clearer. The arrests ignited public pressure like never before. Community vigils for Rana drew hundreds. Candles flickered outside her neighborhood. Her face, once only familiar to family and friends, was now plastered on posters, broadcasts, and news feeds across Texas. But the sorrow of not finding her body overshadowed every development. For her loved ones, Day's confession was not enough. For them, justice without recovery was incomplete. The story of the arrests spread nationally. News outlets outside Texas picked it up, dubbing it one of the most shocking missing person cases of the year. The narrative struck a chord. A respected flight attendant gone without a trace. Her killers brought into the light, not by high-tech forensics or sophisticated police work, but by an accidental phone call. The irony was impossible to ignore. One small pocket dial exposed what months of searching could not. One mistake on a phone dragged two suspects into the open. By September 2025, both Day and Thomas were locked into the justice system. Day sat in jail charged with murder. Thomas, though released on bond, faced trial for obstructing justice. Prosecutors prepared their case. Defense attorneys sharpened their counterarguments.
The stage was set for a courtroom battle that would determine whether the absence of a body could derail the pursuit of accountability. Yet beyond the legal maneuvers, Fort Worth wrestled with grief. The city had rallied to find Rana. Now, it rallied to remember her. Community boards filled with photos and prayers. Airline colleagues spoke of her warmth, her professionalism, her constant smile on long flights. Friends told stories of her laughter, of her reliability, of the small acts of kindness that defined her daily life. The arrests did not erase those memories. They preserved them, underlining what had been stolen. By the close of summer 2025, one truth was clear. Justice had begun to move, but closure remained far away. Rana's body was still missing. Her family's anguish was still raw, and the people of Fort Worth, though grateful for the arrests, were left haunted by the unanswered question: where is Rana now? The turning point of June and August 2025 was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a long road through the courts, the headlines, and the hearts of those who loved her. What was once silence had now become noise. Confessions, charges, hearings, and the relentless search for truth. The arrests marked progress, but they also deepened the mystery. Rana Nofal Soluri had been taken from her community, and even with her killers in custody, her abrupt remained the most painful fact of all. In June 2025, everything shifted. After months of silence and speculation, police in Fort Worth formally arrested Dennis William Day. He was 66 years old, a housemate of Rana Nofal Soluri, and now the central figure in a case that had consumed her family and community. Day confessed to choking Rana during an argument after she threatened to call the police. He admitted to hiding her body in a trash bin, then dumping it off a bridge near Bowie, Texas. His words shocked investigators, but matched evidence already collected. The surveillance footage of him dragging a heavy object into his backyard, the phone and firearm discarded, and the audio from the infamous butt dial. 2 months later, in August, the story widened. Police arrested 62-year-old Joni Thomas, a friend connected to both Day and Rana. Prosecutors alleged that Thomas helped cover up the crime. The butt dial, they said, captured her voice urging Day to secure a container while they struggled to move something heavy. Her charges were obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence. Unlike Day, Thomas posted bond and was released pending trial, but her reputation in Fort Worth collapsed overnight. The arrests set the stage for something larger: formal indictments and the path to trial. Prosecutors in Tarrant County wasted no time. Against Dennis Day, they filed charges of first-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, and evidence tampering. Against Joni Thomas, they filed obstruction and tampering counts. The case had moved beyond rumor, beyond speculation. It was now officially a homicide prosecution, even though Rana's body remained missing. The prosecutor's office made its position clear. Day's confession was credible, consistent, and supported by the evidence. The surveillance camera showed movement in the backyard the night Rana disappeared. The Mazda she had purchased in 2023 had not moved in months. Forensic investigators retrieved her firearm from a storm drain and confirmed it was registered to her. Day admitted tossing her phone into a river. And then there was the butt dial, a bizarre twist of chance that had captured a grim exchange. A man and a woman could be heard moving something heavy. Words like "help me" and "make sure the lid's on" burned into the minds of detectives.
To prosecutors, this was not circumstantial. It was direct proof of concealment. But defense lawyers saw weaknesses. They argued that without a body, there was no certainty Rana was dead. Confessions, they reminded the court, can be coerced or inaccurate. Stress, exhaustion, or confusion could lead someone to admit to things they hadn't done. The defense suggested Day's words may have been misinterpreted, that he panicked and spoke out of fear. For Thomas, the defense pointed out that audio recordings are not perfect. Could the voice truly be confirmed as hers? Was it possible the sounds were misheard? They insisted that no physical evidence tied her directly to handling a body. Legal experts on television debated the challenge ahead. Could a Texas jury convict someone of murder without a body? It had happened before, but it was rare. Juries wanted certainty, something physical. Skeptics said Day's confession alone would not hold if he later recanted in court. Supporters of the prosecution countered that the combination of confession, surveillance, discarded items, and the butt dial created one of the most compelling no-body cases in recent memory. The media storm only grew. Headlines splashed across newspapers and television tickers. Flight attendant vanished, murder trial without a body. National networks aired nightly segments. Journalists descended on Fort Worth, interviewing neighbors, co-workers, and legal analysts. Talk shows framed it as part crime story, part courtroom drama. For months, the case trended on social media under hashtags like #JusticeForRana and #ButtDialEvidence. For Rana's family, the indictments were bittersweet. At press conferences, her relatives spoke through tears. Yes, they said, the arrests brought them closer to answers. But no, it was not enough. They wanted to bring Rana home. Without her body, they could not hold a funeral, could not lay her to rest, could not end the endless waiting. They begged volunteers to continue searching near Bowie, where Day had claimed he left her remains. The pleas made nightly news, stirring public empathy and outrage. The community responded with memorials and marches. Churches organized vigils. Friends of Rana lit candles and released balloons in her honor. Volunteers formed search parties, combing through fields and riverbanks, hoping to find even a trace. To many, it wasn't just about Rana. It was about proving that no one could disappear in silence. That families deserved answers. That justice demanded closure. Pre-trial hearings began in Tarrant County in late summer. Judges reviewed motions, examined whether the evidence met the threshold for trial, and considered defense challenges. Journalists filled the courthouse hallways. Observers called these hearings mini-trials. Each time prosecutors replayed the butt dial recording, the courtroom fell silent. Each time defense attorneys raised doubts, the arguments were dissected online. The hearings confirmed what most already knew. The case would proceed. Day and Thomas would face trial, possibly as early as 2026. Prosecutors vowed to show jurors a timeline of deception, evidence of concealment, and a confession that left little room for doubt. Defense attorneys promised to challenge every link, to argue that absence of a body meant absence of certainty. But one question overshadowed everything. Where was Rana? Even with Day's confession, her remains had not been found. Searches around Bowie continued but yielded nothing. Investigators said heavy flooding in the area may have swept away evidence. For the family, that possibility was unbearable. For the prosecutors, it was a legal hurdle. How do you prove murder without the most fundamental piece of evidence? Still, the indictments marked a turning point. What had begun as a missing person report in March had now become one of the most closely watched homicide cases in Texas. A flight attendant, a trusted community member, vanished. A butt dial exposed the cover-up. A confession pulled the curtain back. And yet, justice was still incomplete. By fall of 2025, the stage was set. Dennis Day sat in custody, awaiting a murder trial that could send him to prison for the rest of his life. Joni Thomas, though out on bond, faced her own charges and public scorn. Rana's family prepared to sit through months of hearings and testimony, clinging to the hope that someone, somewhere, would still find her body. Part 7 closes with the image of two defendants, a grieving family, and a community desperate for resolution. The courtroom would become the next battlefield. Prosecutors, defense lawyers, and jurors would decide the fate of Dennis Day and Joni Thomas. But the larger question remained outside the courthouse, in the fields and rivers of Texas. Where was Rana Nofal Soluri? Until that answer was found, even the strongest verdict would leave an empty space. The arrest of Dennis William Day and Joni Thomas brought headlines, but it didn't bring closure. Rana Nofal Soluri was still missing. Her body had not been recovered. For her family, for her friends, and for her community, that absence was as heavy as the crime itself. Even after Day confessed, even after police traced every movement he described, no one could find her remains. The search teams scoured riverbanks near Bowie, Texas. Divers searched the water below the bridge where Day claimed he dumped her body. Weeks passed, then months, but nothing surfaced. That is the cruel truth about cases like this. Families may know what happened, but they still cannot bury their loved one. They still cannot hold a final goodbye. Rana's family described it as a second layer of grief, knowing she was gone, but not being able to bring her home. In Fort Worth, the case never faded. The phrase, "flight attendant vanished," appeared on every news channel. Candlelight vigils were held in city parks. Neighbors placed photos of Rana in their windows. Her co-workers at the airline created a memorial fund in her name, and passengers saw her face on flyers across Texas airports. For Rana's family, each vigil was both comforting and painful. Comforting because the community cared. Painful because every candle reminded them that Rana was still missing. Her husband attended events but kept a low profile, overwhelmed by the media. Her relatives spoke more publicly, demanding justice and insisting the search for her body continue. Meanwhile, the legal system prepared for trial. Prosecutors in Tarrant County assembled their case. They would argue that the confession, the butt dial, the surveillance footage, and the recovered firearm together painted a clear picture of murder. Defense attorneys prepared to counter, focusing on the lack of a body and raising doubts about the reliability of confessions under stress. Legal experts noted the risk. The reflection on this case is harsh. Rana was 47 years old. She was a flight attendant, known for her kindness and professionalism. She had no history of disappearing, no record of violence, no enemies. Yet she vanished in her own home, at the hands of someone she trusted enough to live with. That betrayal cut deepest for her family. To them, Rana's story was not just about a crime. It was about how danger can hide in plain sight, how killers can live under the same roof, and how justice sometimes arrives without closure. Her relatives still search. Even after the indictments, they continue to walk fields near Bowie, holding photographs and asking volunteers to join them. "We will not rest until Rana is home," one family member said. Those words echoed through Texas news stations, becoming a rallying cry. The case also left a mark on the justice system. Prosecutors now face the test of persuading a jury to convict without a body. Defense lawyers will challenge every piece of evidence. And the public will watch, waiting to see whether the system can deliver a verdict that matches the reality everyone already believes. Rana was murdered. But beyond the courtroom, the human story remains. A family broken, a community shaken, a city that refuses to forget. Even now, the central question hangs in the air. Where is Rana Nofal Soluri? Until her body is found, that question will haunt every candlelit vigil, every courtroom hearing, every headline. And that is the reflection this case leaves behind. Justice can punish the guilty, but true closure is something else. Closure requires a place to grieve, a grave to visit, a final answer to the question of where. As of today, Rana's loved ones don't have that, and so the story of her disappearance doesn't end with an arrest or even with a trial. It ends with an open wound, a lingering silence, and a community still searching for the woman who vanished. Justice, in this case, may come in the courtroom, but justice for Rana will only be complete when she is brought home. So we are left with a question for you. Where is Rana? And will the truth ever be found? Because sometimes the hardest part of a crime is not what happened. It's what remains unknown.